So as you know by now, you need to write a final paper for this class. And in this final paper, you're going to have to draw a few graphs. This video is going to explain pretty much how to draw these graphs and what I'm looking for in these graphs. So, as you can see on the screen, we have 4 different supply and demand graphs. Each one of them is slightly different, but they all hold true with the same basic principles. The first thing to notice is that we have a vertical and a horizontal axis. And on each vertical axis you have a P, and each horizontal axis you have a Q. This indicates that price is on the vertical axis and quantity is on the horizontal axis. And if we look at all 4 of these graphs, we see that P and price is always on the vertical axis and quantity is always on the horizontal axis. The next thing that we notice is that each one of these graphs have a supply and a demand line. And this is denoted, and supply is always going to be blue in this video, and demand is going to be, demand is blue and supply is red in these videos. And you see something about each one of them, is that each one of them is labeled. Here we have S0, also known as S0, demand 0, or D0. We have SO, DO, S prime, and D prime, and then S and D. Now, each one of these lines is labeled, but they're all labeled something different. And I wanted to do that in this video to show you that there is no standard way to label these lines. So here we have S0 and D0, or S0 or D0. Here we have SO and DO. This stands for S original and demand original. Here we have S prime and D prime, and here we have just a standard S and D. So this goes to show that you can label these lines in multiple ways, and depending on the situation, you're going to be labeling it in different ways. If you get into a scenario where you have multiple supply and demand lines, you might be giving it particular names, like such as, in this case, we have S original and S new, and here you have demand original. And over here you have S0 and D0. This is some of the more standard ways to draw a graph is using the S0 and D0. Another standard way is using just S and D. So you can do it in a multiple of ways. Just make sure that they're mirror images of each other and that they match. So here we have S0 and D0. We don't have S0 and D, or S0 and D prime, or S0 and D in. They match. We have S0 and D0. And you can see that in all of these cases. The reasons you wanted to label it this way and make sure that they match each other is to show that this is the original lines. These are the first ones. And then and that helps distinguish as we get into movements. Another thing to notice is that we have the equilibrium price and quantity off of this original graph clearly marked. Here we have original price is known as P0, Q0, and the original quantity is Q0. Here we have the same thing, only this is PO and QO. Well, why do we have a PO and QO and a P0 and Q0 over here? Well, if you notice, our original supply and demand lines are labeled as S original and D original on this graph. So we're going to have it labeled as P original and Q original on this graph. Whereas this one, we look at S0 and D0, we have it labeled as Q0 and P0. We label it this way in order to identify the first versus the second movements. And in these graphs, we're only seeing one movement, but oftentimes in graphs, you might see a change in demand 2 or 3 times or a change in supply 2 or 3 times. So as a result, we have it labeled in correspondence. The price and quantity is labeled in correspondence with the supply and demand that's affecting it. Down here, we see it again. We have it labeled as just S and D. So as a result, we have it labeled as P and Q. Over here, we have it labeled as S prime and D prime for the original line. So we have P prime and Q prime. And another thing to notice, we have these nice dotted lines showing where equilibrium is at. So I would strongly encourage you, actually I'm going to pretty much make it mandatory that you include these dotted lines in there to make everything just look a little cleaner and showing exactly where that equilibrium price and quantity is going to be. So that pretty much sums up the original lines that's going to be on your graph. It's going to be this horizontal and vertical axis labeled P and Q. You're going to have the original supply line, original demand line, and you're going to have the original price and original quantity. But in each one of your graphs that you're going to draw, you're going to have a shift, a change in either the supply or the demand curve. So what we have is we have 4 examples here showing the possible supply or demand shifts. Over here we have, on this side, we have these shift in demand curves. So for example, we have a outward shift in the demand curve in this first graph. So as a result, we go from D0 to D1. And the standard scenario, or the standard situation, is if you label this as D0, then you label this one as D1. And we'll see as we go through here that if you label your original lines a certain way, you need to label your first movement in a certain way as well. So here, we go from D to D1. This is our shift into the demand curve. So this could be something along the lines of people are demanding more tractors for whatever reason. Let's say that interest rates fall, so people now demand more goods. As a result, we see the demand curve shift outward. So we have to show this change in this demand curve, and we label that demand curve. It's very important to label every single line that you draw. And also to help us out, we draw these nice arrows showing the movement and the motion and the direction in which these supply or demand curves are changing. So as a result of this demand curve shift, we have a new equilibrium price and quantity. Well, since this is the first movement, then this is the first change in price and quantity. Because it's the first change, we also have to change how we're labeling this equilibrium price and quantity. Here we labeled it P0. Here we're going to label it P1. Clearly indicating that there is a shift, there's a change. Now if we had another shift in either the supply or demand curve, let's say that we drew another demand curve out here, we would actually label that D2. And the equilibrium price and quantity off of that would be denoted as, say, P2 or Q2. Keeping in the same pattern as what we are doing with the changes and the labeling of these new curves and new equilibrium prices and quantities. And as we can see here, as we shift and have a new equilibrium price, we actually show a movement by an arrow here and then here to show a change in quantity. And again, we have these nice dotted lines. So this is how I want these graphs drawn. You can use straight lines to make it nice and pretty and simple. But you use these graphs, you use these simplistic models to explain how things are changing. So you would use this graph right here, for example, to say, because of lowered interest rates, there has been a shift in demand. So because of, say, low interest rates, it's now lowering the cost of production for the farmer, therefore increasing their demand, shifting their demand outward. And we can see that by the movement from D0 to D1. And that new demand curve creates a new equilibrium at P1 and Q1. So we see that there is an increase in the quantity that is being demanded as well as an increase in price. So that's how you would kind of explain a graph like this. So we move down here and now we have a shift in the demand curve, but an inward shift. And we originally labeled our labels as S and D. Well, the first shift now is going to be labeled as D prime or D apostrophe. And again, we have a shift or a movement along the price, a change in price and a change in quantity. So we can see that as it goes from Q to Q prime, Q prime, and P to P prime. And again, we have these nice arrows showing us this movement. So an explanation of a graph like this is we could say something like, because of the decreased population in this area, the aggregate demand for goods has now fallen. We can see that by the shift from D to D prime. and that has now decreased the quantity demanded from Q to Q prime, and it's decreased the price as well from P to P prime. And we can see that by the movement on this graph. So that would kind of explain a graph like this, where with an inward shift in demand. Now we move over to these two graphs and we see changes in supply. So up here we labeled these original lines as DO and SO, indicating that this is demand original, supply original. You might get into a scenario where you actually give names to these lines. And that's what I've done here. This is demand original, supply original. And we have this shift and we say that this is supply new, so known as supply in. And as a result, we have the corresponding QO and QN, PO and PN going along with the naming, the way we name these particular lines. So we can say that originally we had the original supply and demand curve, but because of favorable weather conditions, we have a new supply curve, and we can see that as an outward shift in the supply curve denoted by the movement or the shift from S0 or S0 to Sn. As a result, we have lower prices going from P original to Pn, and we have an increased quantity that is being supplied, or increased quantity going from Q original to Qn. And again, on this graph, we see that the arrows are showing the movement of both the quantities and the prices, as well as a shift in that supply curve. Down here is the last graph we're going to talk about, and that's going to be a inward shift of the supply curve. Now, something to notice is that our original lines are denoted as S prime and D prime. Now, over here we said that the first shift was known as D prime. Well, if you clearly identify that your original lines are known as S prime and D prime, then you can label these S prime and D prime, or label these the way you want. It just needs to be clearly identified that these are the original lines. So we can say that an inward shift in the supply curve, let's say something like the price of inputs now is increased, so there is an increased shift in supply. So we have a shift from S to S, or S prime to S double prime here. And as a result, we have a decreased quantity going from Q prime to Q double prime, and a increased price going from P prime to P double prime. And again, we have the arrows drawn on all of these movements. So the main thing that you want to do whenever you're drawing these graphs is you want to first and foremost draw your vertical and horizontal axis and label it appropriately with P and Q. The next thing you want to do is you want to draw your supply and your original supply and demand curve and label these as well. Then you want to draw your secondary or your first movement, or actually before that you want to label your equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity off of that original line. Then the next thing that you want to do is draw your first movement, so it can be either a shift in demand or supply, and you want to draw your first price change. And you want to make sure that every line that you draw is labeled and to include these arrows. Also, it really helps out to include these dotted lines so that way we can see where equilibrium price and quantity is going to be. I hope this video helps you out in kind of knowing what is expected of you when drawing these graphs, and kind of give a little bit of an explanation on these graphs. The key things to make sure that you have in this paper is to make sure that all of your graphs are labeled and labeled appropriately. I would encourage you to give them a title. Actually, I would like for you to give them a title of what is going on in that graph. And the last thing that I would like for you to do or to take into consideration is I want you to explain these graphs. So in this video I talked about all of these movements and kind of explained them a little bit. Whenever you're writing this paper, you're going to need to explain what is happening in this graph and why it's happening the way it is. And that's where we really get to see that you've developed your economic concepts. Because I really don't, it's nice to draw these graphs, but you have to know what the graphs mean. And that's going to be shown whenever you're explaining these graphs in your paper.